Okay everyone, installment 15 is on, so listen up while I discuss what's happening now. Sort of. Today's topic of interest is Egypt and the state of affairs it has under post-Arab Spring and subsequent aftermath President Abdul Fattah al-Sisi. Before I discuss Mr. Sisi's current administration in Egypt and what's been going on in Egypt while he's been president, allow me to point out two things. First off, let me say that as someone who speaks English as my primary language, I can't help but chuckle whenever I see the guy's last name is Sisi. It's even funnier considering he used to hold military rank. So yeah, I'll likely make a few jokes about his last name to any of his supporters or Egyptian listeners. I know I'm probably mispronouncing the name. I ask that you don't take offense by the jokes. I'm mainly just being silly about it. That said, the second thing I'd like to point out is that I'll be examining the relevant events and state of Egypt prior to Sisi's rise to power and how things have changed or stayed the same since then. So buckle up everyone, because it's story time. Now, Egypt turned from monarchy to a republic in 1953 following a military coup known as the 1952 Revolution. The first president of the Egyptian Republic was General Mohammed Naguib. He didn't really last long in power because the real architect of the 1952 movement, Gamal Abdel Nasser, forced him to resign in 1954. Nasser assumed presidential power in Egypt in 1956, and three major things occurred under Nasser's presidency from what I can tell. First off, Nasser was the president of Egypt who was responsible for nationalizing the Suez Canal under Egyptian control on July 26, 1956. This prompted the Suez Crisis, which led to Israel, France, and Britain invading Egypt to regain Western control of the Suez Canal. And this essentially led to Egypt under Nasser having friendlier relations with the Soviet Union as opposed to Western powers. Secondly, Nasser was president during the Six-Day War, which happened in 1967, and this was when Israel attacked Egypt and occupied the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. And during this time, Egypt enacted what was called the Emergency Law, which extended government police powers, suspended constitutional rights, and legalized censorship. And third, near the end of Nasser's time as president, the Egyptian economy was on the verge of collapse. Then 1970 came along, and Nasser passed away, and his successor, Anwar Sadat, came to power. Three major things happened under Sadat's presidency. Number one, Sadat shifted Egypt's Cold War allegiance from the Soviet Union to the United States, and expelled Soviet advisors in 1972 from Egypt while simultaneously implementing economic reforms. Number two, under Sadat, Egypt, along with Syria, launched a surprise attack on Israel in 1973 known as the October War and reclaimed the Sinai Peninsula from Israel in the peace treaty that followed, known as the Camp David Accords. Number three, because of Sadat's signing of the Camp David Accords, in 1979, Egypt suffered backlash from the Arab world and was expelled from the Arab League. Sadat was also assassinated by an Islamic extremist. Then came Mohammed Hosni al-Said Mubarak, who won the presidency of Egypt in a referendum where he was the only candidate. Under Mubarak, Egypt suffered several domestic problems, including mass poverty, unemployment, terrorist attacks, and various human rights violations. His presidency also saw the passage of Syndicates Law in 1993, Press Law 1995, and Non-Governmental Associations Law in 1999. Essentially, these laws made Egypt's parliament politics irrelevant, and other means of political expression were curtailed. It was a dictatorship masquerading as a democracy, and despite all this, Mubarak was in power for nearly 30 years, from 1981 all the way to 2011. However, Mubarak, as president, wasn't the major center of power in Egypt. As with most dictatorships, the dictator is only as powerful as long as he had the support of the military to keep the unrest minimal. In early 2011, as part of the Arab Spring movement, widespread protests broke out in Egypt seeking Mubarak's resignation. When push came to shove, Mubarak obliged and resigned as president, and the Egyptian military took power. The constitution was suspended, and the military dissolved the parliament. A parliamentary election was held in November of 2011, and Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood was elected president of Egypt. Morsi was the first democratically elected head of state in Egyptian history. Problem was, even though he was voted in by the majority, minority secular groups were concerned he would institute strict Islamic law on them. So they walked out of the Constituent Assembly and essentially told him to go screw himself. Morsi's response to this? He issued a declaration preventing his presidential decrees or the work of the now solely Muslim Brotherhood-controlled Constituent Assembly from being challenged. So Egyptians opposed to Morsi took to the streets in December of 2012, and thousands of Morsi's supporters violently clashed with his opponents on December 5th of 2012. In the end, Morsi's rule didn't last long, as he was ousted on July 3rd of 2013. This brings us to Egypt's sixth and current president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who resigned as the head of the Egyptian armed forces and the military and announced he would run for Egyptian presidency in 2014. He won by a landslide. However, the Muslim Brotherhood and some liberal and secular groups boycotted voting in the election. Turnout was actually lower in the 2014 election that Sisi won. It was at 46%, compared to the turnout in the 2012 election that Morsi won, which was at 52%. So now that we're up to speed on how Egypt got to being with Sisi as president, what newsworthy stuff has Sisi's administration done, or rather, what has occurred while he's been president thus far? Well, the Muslim Brotherhood has been made illegal in Egypt, and mass arrests and trials have been held of its members under Sisi's presidency. Several hundreds of which, who have been tried, have received a death sentence. The only person who has actually been confirmed to be put to death, though, so far, is the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood chief. Despite what some are calling essentially a rehash of the old regime of military dictatorship under Mubarak, but with a different person in charge, opinion polls in August of last year show that 89% of the people polled said the security situation in Egypt has actually improved. What about economically, though? In many ways, after all, it was the unrest over poor economic conditions in Egypt that caused protests over Mubarak in the first place in 2011. Have things improved under Sisi? Unfortunately, it doesn't appear to be the case. In an effort to cut government spending so as not to sink Egypt further into debt and economic turmoil, fuel prices in Egypt were raised by 78% because basic food and energy subsidies were cut. Of course, emphasizing that everyone must make sacrifices, Sisi cut his presidential salary by 50%. In opinion polls related to economic improvements in Egypt's situation, only 35% believe price controls have improved the situation. Sisi's administration is also working to expand the Suez Canal, and a project is being suggested to move the capital of Egypt. That, of course, likely won't be cheap to do. But what's my opinion on all of this? Well, as an outside observer looking in, I'd have to say Egypt's situation under Sisi doesn't seem to have improved much. Then again, it's hardly been a year since he officially took office. Honestly, though, the real issue here, I think, is how strict the government is cracking down on public dissent. The optimist in me would like to think that this guy does care about Egypt and wants to pull his country out of crisis and bring back order. So he's used the military power for the greater good and doesn't want Egyptian unrest to occur and stir things up again. But who's to say Sisi isn't just weeding out the opposition now, so that in 4 years' time when he's up for re-election, or in 8 years' time when he doesn't adhere to term limits and decides to stay in power, there isn't enough opposition to stand against him. I suppose time will tell what Sisi's true intentions are. Okay, time to change the subject and discuss why nature hates us. or at least why it hates Florida. Now, the Sunshine State has a lot of troubles with nature. There are the hurricanes and tropical storms in the summer, the troubling trends of rising sea levels, possibly putting certain areas of the state prone to severe flooding, and there's more stuff, but if I keep on, this would drag on for too long. So let's just focus on the topic and problem I wanted to bring to your attention the most in relation to the Sunshine State. That topic being invasive species, or if you're unfamiliar with what that phrase means, it's essentially an animal that doesn't have a natural habitat in a place, but if released into the wild, would reproduce fast and threatens to kill off the natural wildlife in the area. The ones folks normally think of when they hear the phrases invasive species and Florida is the Burmese python, which a couple of years ago news surfaced of one eating a Florida alligator whole. A lesser known but equally dangerous python, also threatening Florida wildlife, is the African rock python. In the water, ruining aquatic life and disrupting coral reefs, is the lionfish. And now, because 3 problems aren't enough, there's yet another invasive animal causing trouble, the Nile monitor lizard. These bastards are native to sub-Saharan Africa and on average grow to 5 feet long, but larger ones can grow up to 7 to 8 feet. They don't menace humans normally, but they can inflict serious wounds onto someone who isn't careful. They're also carnivorous and a dangerous predator to anything smaller than them, so there's a risk of them hurting a toddler. And for cat lovers, I've got some bad news. These things sometimes eat cats too. Nature isn't entirely to blame on this one though, as this is due in large part to reckless pet owners, but still, damn it, nature. Now then, here's a recommendation. For my American listeners of the working class, the deadline to finish filing your tax returns is quickly approaching. In that same vein, I thought I would suggest a light, short read this week with some relation to that. The book is called The Way to Wealth by American founding father Benjamin Franklin. It's a short story about a man called Father Abraham who speaks to a crowd waiting for an auction to begin, who when asked by the crowd what advice he has to being financially successful, Abraham starts to quote various of Franklin's previous works. The book essentially sums up all of Franklin's previous works and teachings about finding success financially, and though written in 1758, the book is still popular today, and its simple advice is still as useful and true. And considering its author is currently on the American $100 bill, I think the advice is worth checking out. Links in the description. And with that, we're done here. Have a safe week, and I'll talk to you next Sunday. Toodles!